I didn't think his hand would linger. I didn't think my breath would catch in my throat. But it did, and now I can't shake the memory of what happened that day in Lincoln Park. David was gone again, off to some urgent client meeting. He'd barely looked at me when he rushed out the door, his tie loose, coffee mug in hand, leaving me standing there in the kitchen like a shadow of someone I used to be. The walls of our house were suffocating. Too much silence. Too much distance. So, when Andrew, my stepson, shuffled into the living room, I grabbed my jacket before I even knew what I was doing. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. Andrew looked up from his phone, eyebrows raised. "Where?" "Lincoln Park. Just anywhere but here." He hesitated, but when I opened the front door, he followed. The drive to the park felt like holding my breath underwater. Andrew sat slouched in the passenger seat, his headphones draped around his neck, scrolling aimlessly on his phone. The city rushed past the windows, the trees along the street blurring into green streaks. When we pulled into the parking lot, I parked crooked, barely caring. "Come on," I said, already stepping out. The sun was brutal, pouring down through the golden leaves, but it didn't soften the knot twisting in my stomach. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and the faint sweetness of the pond. Families were scattered everywhere, laughing, shouting, living. It was a sharp contrast to the emptiness I felt every time I looked at my marriage. We wandered the walking trail, Andrew a few paces behind me, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He'd grown so much in the past year. Broad shoulders and easy stride. Sometimes I caught myself forgetting he was still just a teenager. "I think I'll take a break," I said when we reached the pond. I gestured to a nearby bench, the wood sun-warmed and inviting. Andrew shrugged and sat down beside me, his legs stretched out in front of him. "You've been acting weird lately," he said, not looking at me. His words hit like a slap, sharper than the crisp autumn breeze. "What?" I turned to him, startled. "You just seem, I don't know, different." The bluntness in his tone caught me off guard. "I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly. Andrew finally met my eyes, his gaze steady and unnervingly calm. "You don't look fine." I wanted to argue, but something about the way he was watching me stopped me cold. It wasn't the look of a boy asking out of obligation. It was deeper, almost protective. "I'm just tired," I mumbled, breaking the stare. "Of Dad." His words were a punch to the gut. I felt my breath hitch. "Andrew, you don't have to lie." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I see how he is. Always gone. Barely talks to you. It's not fair." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words got tangled in my throat. How could he see so clearly what I'd been trying to deny for years? We sat there in silence for a moment, the tension between us crackling like a live wire. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay," he said finally, his voice soft. "Thank you," I whispered, my throat tight. He nodded, his eyes lingering on mine for a beat too long. My heart jumped. "Let's head back," I said abruptly, standing so quickly I nearly tripped on the uneven pavement. The walk back to the car was heavier, the space between us thick with something unspoken. I felt hyper-aware of every step, every accidental brush of his shoulder against mine. The drive home was suffocatingly quiet. Andrew stared out the window, his jaw set. I gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. When we pulled into the driveway, David's car wasn't there. Of course, it wasn't. Andrew climbed out without a word, heading upstairs as I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't understand, or didn't want to. I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the empty mug David had left on the counter. My reflection in the window looked like a stranger. Something had shifted that day in the park, something I wasn't ready to name. And as much as I tried to push it down, I knew I couldn't undo what had started. I didn't mean to flinch, I told myself, staring at the water, my skin burning under the sun. But it wasn't the sunburn that made my pulse quicken. It was his hand, warm and steady, lingering just a moment too long on my shoulder. It started innocently. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. We had settled on a quiet spot near the edge of Lincoln Park's pond, the kind of place where the sounds of the city faded into rustling leaves and the occasional laughter of kids chasing ducks. Andrew stretched out on the grass, scrolling through his phone while I unpacked a picnic blanket. The sun was high, relentless, and I could already feel my skin tightening under its heat. "Can you help me with this?" I called out, holding up a bottle of sunscreen. Andrew glanced up, his brow furrowed slightly. Yes, sure, he said, pushing himself off the ground. I sat down on the edge of the blanket, facing the water, and handed him the bottle. "Just my shoulders and back," I said, trying to keep my tone light. He hesitated for a moment before squeezing the lotion into his hands. I felt the first touch, cold, smooth, and practical. But as his hands moved, spreading the sunscreen across my shoulders and down to the middle of my back, something shifted. His movement slowed. Or maybe it was just me, hyper-aware of every press of his fingers. "It's fine," I told myself. "He's just helping." But then his hand paused, just for a second too long, just at the base of my neck. A spark, small, uninvited, and deeply unsettling, flickered in my chest. "You okay?" His voice broke the silence, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. "Yeah," I said quickly, my voice tighter than I intended. "Thanks, that's enough." He pulled back, and I felt the absence of his touch like a jolt. I turned to look at him, expecting some kind of awkward smile, but his expression was unreadable, neutral, maybe even thoughtful. "You missed a spot," he said, gesturing toward my shoulder. "It's fine," I snapped a little too sharply. Andrew shrugged and stepped back, shoving his hands into his pockets. "All right," he muttered, his tone casual, but his eyes flickered, catching mine for just a moment before he turned away. I stayed on the blanket, staring out at the pond, the bottle of sunscreen still in my lap. My heart was racing, and I hated myself for it. "It's nothing," I whispered. "It's nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. We walked a little, talked about nothing, and eventually ended up at a food truck near the edge of the park. I tried to shake the tension, to pretend everything was normal. Andrew seemed fine, maybe even indifferent. But every so often, I'd catch him glancing at me, his expression impossible to read. By the time we got back to the car, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. Andrew tossed his backpack into the back seat and climbed into the passenger seat. "Thanks for today," he said as I started the engine. I nodded, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Sure." But as we drove home, the air between us felt thick, like a conversation waiting to happen. When we got back, David's car was in the driveway. The sight of it should have brought relief, but instead, it felt like a bucket of cold water. Andrew went straight to his room, leaving me alone in the kitchen. David was in the living room, typing furiously on his laptop. He glanced up when I walked in, gave me a quick smile, and went back to his work. "How was the park?" he asked, not looking up. "Fine," I said, my voice steady. It was fine. But it wasn't. I stayed in the kitchen long after David had gone upstairs, the bottle of sunscreen still sitting on the counter. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed today, something I couldn't name, but knew I couldn't ignore. I caught him staring again. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, his eyes lingering on me a second longer than they should, the faintest twitch of his lips like he was debating whether to say something. But he never did. And I didn't ask. The days after our trip to Lincoln Park blurred into an uncomfortable routine. Andrew seemed to gravitate toward me more than usual, sitting closer at the dinner table, finding excuses to be in the same room, offering to help with chores he'd never shown interest in before. It should have been innocent. Maybe it was. But every time he walked into the room, I felt the weight of his presence, like an invisible thread pulling us closer. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room. The late-day sun poured through the windows, casting long golden streaks across the floor. David was upstairs, pacing his office on yet another work call. Andrew wandered in, holding a glass of water, his steps deliberate but casual. "Need help?" he asked, gesturing to the pile of laundry on the couch. "I've got it," I said quickly, not looking up. He sat down anyway, picking up a towel and folding it neatly. For a while, we worked in silence, the rhythmic sound of fabric being smoothed and folded filling the room. "You've been quiet lately," he said, breaking the stillness. I froze for a fraction of a second before forcing a smile. "Just busy." Andrew didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his attention to the towel in his hands, folding and refolding it as if searching for the right words. "You don't seem happy," he said finally, his voice low but steady. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. "What?" "With everything," he clarified, glancing at me. "With Dad. With this." "This." My voice cracked, and I hated how defensive I sounded. He shrugged, his gaze meeting mine for just a moment before drifting back to the towel. "I just mean you seem different." I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but the lump in my throat wouldn't let me. Instead, I turned back to the laundry, my hands trembling as I reached for another shirt. "I'm fine," I said quietly, not looking at him. But we both knew it was a lie. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I felt his eyes on me again. He was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, but every now and then, I'd catch him watching me. It was fleeting, like a shadow passing across the wall, but it left a knot in my stomach every time. David came home late, his usual rushed apologies spilling out as he kissed me on the cheek. He barely glanced at Andrew before retreating upstairs to finish some last-minute work. The three of us ate dinner in near silence, the tension in the room thick and suffocating. Andrew's foot brushed mine under the table, and I flinched, my fork clattering against my plate. "Sorry," he mumbled, but his eyes lingered on mine for a beat too long. David didn't notice. He never noticed. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, my mind wouldn't stop replaying the day. The way Andrew had looked at me, the way his voice softened when he asked if I was okay. It wasn't just his words, it was the way they made me feel, like someone was finally seeing me. But it wasn't right. It couldn't be. I turned over, facing the wall, my back to David. He was already asleep, his breathing deep and even. I stared at the faint outline of moonlight on the wall, trying to silence the storm in my chest. The next morning, I found Andrew in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee. He looked up when I walked in, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The air between us felt heavy, like we were standing on opposite sides of a glass wall, both aware of the cracks forming but too afraid to acknowledge them. I busied myself at the sink, washing dishes that didn't need washing, my hands trembling under the water. When I turned around, Andrew was still there, watching me with that same quiet intensity. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. The question was simple, but the weight behind it made my chest tighten. "I'm fine," I said automatically. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. That look stayed with me all day, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I told myself it was nothing, just a moment of kindness, but deep down I knew it was more than that. And it scared me. "I think it's stuck," I said, pulling at the cabinet door, my voice tight with frustration. Andrew was leaning against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, watching me struggle with a faint smirk. "Here, let me try," he offered, stepping closer. It had been one of those long, quiet afternoons where the house felt impossibly empty. David was at the office, of course, and the silence had started to feel like it might crush me. I'd decided to clean out the pantry, hoping the mindless task would settle my restless thoughts. But now the cabinet door was jammed, refusing to budge. Andrew reached over me, his hand brushing mine as he grabbed the handle. The movement was casual, natural even, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "You just need to pull harder," he said, his voice calm as he gave the door a firm tug. It popped open with a loud creak, and a stack of boxes came tumbling out. I gasped as one of them struck my shoulder, the impact sharper than I expected. "Are you okay?" Andrew asked, stepping closer, his hand instinctively going to my arm. "I'm fine," I said quickly, brushing off the sting. But he didn't let go. Instead, his hand lingered, his thumb grazing the fabric of my sleeve as if checking for any real injury. I froze, suddenly hyper-aware of how close he was, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the detergent on his shirt. "You sure?" he asked, his voice softer now. I nodded, but I couldn't find my voice. The silence between us grew heavy, and when I finally looked up, his eyes were already on me. There was something in them I hadn't seen before, an intensity that made my breath catch. It should have ended there. I should have stepped back, thanked him, and moved on. But I didn't. Andrew didn't move either. His hand slid down my arm, slow and deliberate, until it reached my wrist. His grip was light, hesitant, like he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. The tension between us was unbearable, like the room had shrunk and the air had thickened. Every rational part of me screamed to stop, to break the moment before it went too far. But another part, a darker, lonelier part, kept me rooted in place. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time he'd said my name like that, without the usual stepmother distance, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I should get back to cleaning," I stammered, my voice shaking. But I didn't move. Andrew's hand tightened slightly around mine, just enough to make my pulse quicken. "You don't have to," he said, his eyes searching mine for something I wasn't sure I could give. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then it happened. He leaned in, slow enough that I could have stopped him, but I didn't. His forehead brushed mine, his breath warm against my cheek. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. "This isn't," I started, but the words caught in my throat. "I know," he said, his voice heavy with something I couldn't name. For a moment, we stayed like that, suspended in the impossible weight of the moment. And then his lips brushed mine, tentative, barely there. It was so fleeting I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. But then he pulled back, his eyes wide with shock, like he couldn't believe what he'd just done. "I'm sorry," he blurted, stepping away. "It's fine," I said quickly, though nothing about it was fine. My cheeks burned, and my hands trembled as I clutched the edge of the counter, desperate to steady myself. Andrew opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He just shook his head, his jaw tight, before turning and leaving the kitchen. I stood there for what felt like hours, the echoes of the moment replaying in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just a mistake, a line crossed in a moment of confusion. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his words looping in my head. "You don't have to." I didn't know what terrified me more, the fact that it had happened or the fact that part of me didn't regret it. I couldn't look him in the eyes. Every time Andrew walked into the room, my stomach twisted into knots, so tight, I thought I might be sick. But what I felt wasn't just guilt. It was something heavier, darker, something I couldn't name. The kitchen incident played on a loop in my mind. The touch, the words, the kiss. I wanted to rewind, to erase it, but it was already there, etched into the fragile fabric of my sanity. David didn't notice a thing. He never did. He came home late that night, kissed me absently on the forehead, and went straight to his office, muttering about an email he needed to send. His indifference should have brought relief, but instead, it made the guilt sharper, more unbearable. Andrew, for his part, barely spoke. The next morning, he sat across from me at the breakfast table, staring down at his plate. His fork scraped against the ceramic, an unbearable sound in the suffocating silence. "How's your omelet?" I asked, the question landing awkwardly in the space between us. "It's fine," he muttered without looking up. Fine. Everything was fine. Except it wasn't. The tension followed us, like a shadow. Andrew spent most of the day in his room, the door half open as if he wanted me to look in but didn't have the courage to ask. I busied myself with housework, scrubbing the counters until my knuckles ached, folding laundry I'd already folded the day before. Anything to avoid thinking about the widening crack between us. But every so often, I'd catch him watching me from the corner of his eye. A glance when I passed by his room. A fleeting look from across the hallway. It was like he was searching for something, some unspoken reassurance that I couldn't give him. That evening, I was in the living room, pretending to read, when I felt him enter the room. My pulse quickened, but I didn't look up. "Hey," he said softly, standing in the doorway. I glanced up briefly, forcing a smile that felt hollow. "Hey." He shifted awkwardly, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Do you need help with anything?" "No," I said quickly, too quickly. "I've fine." The silence that followed was unbearable. He stood there for a moment longer, like he wanted to say something, but then he turned and walked away. David came downstairs an hour later, laptop in hand. "I'm heading back to the office," he said, his tone so casual it made my chest ache. "Late deadline. Don't wait up." "Okay," I said quietly, watching him grab his keys and leave without a second thought. The door clicked shut, and the emptiness of the house settled over me like a heavy fog. Andrew found me in the kitchen later that night. I was washing dishes, my hands submerged in soapy water, staring blankly out the window. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low but steady. The words hit like a slap, and I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the sink. "I'm not," I lied. "Yes, you are," he said, stepping closer. I turned to face him, my chest tight with panic. His eyes were intense, searching mine for something I didn't know how to give. "Andrew, we need to." "Forget it happened," he interrupted, his jaw tight. "Pretend it didn't mean anything?" "It didn't," I said quickly, the words cutting both of us. His expression twisted, a mix of anger and hurt flashing across his face. "Then why can't you even look at me?" I didn't have an answer. The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with the weight of everything unsaid. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming, and for a moment, I thought he might say something that would shatter what little composure I had left. Instead, he shook his head and turned away, his shoulders tense as he walked out of the kitchen. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. David was snoring softly beside me, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I wanted to tell myself it wasn't real, that the moment in the kitchen had been nothing but a mistake born of loneliness and confusion. But the truth was it felt real, too real. And I didn't know how to stop the pull I felt every time Andrew looked at me. In the quiet darkness, I realized something terrifying. The line between guilt and desire wasn't as clear as I'd thought. And the more I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, the more impossible it became to ignore. "I think we need to set some boundaries," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Andrew stood in the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. "Boundaries?" he repeated, the words sharp like a knife. "Yes," I said, turning back to the counter, where I was chopping vegetables with more force than necessary. Whatever happened, it was a mistake. We need to move on. Act like it never happened." The silence behind me was deafening. I could feel his eyes on my back, the weight of his presence, making it hard to breathe. "Act like it never happened," he finally said, his voice low and edged with something I couldn't quite place. "Yes," I snapped, spinning around to face him. "Because it didn't mean anything, Andrew. It can't." His jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought he was going to yell. But when he spoke, his words were quiet, measured. "It didn't mean anything to you?" I froze, the knife still in my hand. "Andrew, don't answer me," he said, taking a step closer. "Did it mean nothing to you?" My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to find the words. "It doesn't matter what it meant," I said finally, my voice trembling. "What matters is that it can't happen again. It was wrong." "Wrong." His voice rose, the calm facade cracking. "You keep saying it was wrong, but you don't act like it. You look at me like—" "Stop," I interrupted, my hands shaking. "No, I won't stop," he said, his frustration spilling over. "You can't just brush this under the rug, Sarah. You can't pretend it didn't happen." I stepped back, pressing myself against the counter as he moved closer. The intensity in his eyes was overwhelming, and I hated how part of me wanted to stay in this moment, to let him speak the words I couldn't bear to say. "Do you know how hard it is to sit in the same room with you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but no less raw. "To pretend like I'm fine when I'm not?" I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. "Andrew, I'm your stepmother. Do you understand how wrong this is?" "You're not my mother," he said quickly, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "You've never been my mother, and I don't see you that way." The room fell silent, his confession hanging heavy between us. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. "You feel it too," he said, taking another step closer. "Don't you?" "Stop it," I whispered, my voice breaking. But he didn't stop. "Just tell me the truth," he said, his tone almost pleading now. "Do you feel it, or am I crazy?" I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the moment to end, but his words lingered in the space between us, impossible to ignore. "Andrew," I said finally, my voice shaking. "This has to stop. Whatever you think this is, it can't be. I'm married to your father. I love him." "Do you?" he asked, his voice sharper now. "Do you really love him, or are you just saying that because it's easier than admitting the truth?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to yell at him, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was tangled in my throat, impossible to unravel. "You don't know what you're talking about," I said weakly, turning away from him. "I know more than you think," he said, his voice steady but heavy with frustration. "And I know that pretending this didn't happen isn't going to make it go away." The sound of the front door opening cut through the tension like a gunshot. "Sarah?" David's voice echoed from the hallway, casual and unsuspecting. Andrew stepped back instantly, his expression hardening as he glanced toward the door. I turned away, grabbing the cutting board and pretending to focus on the vegetables in front of me. David appeared in the kitchen a moment later, his tie loosened and his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. "Hey," he said, smiling briefly before glancing at Andrew. "You two okay?" "We're fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. Andrew didn't say a word. He just nodded, his jaw tight, before brushing past David and disappearing upstairs. David watched him go, his brow furrowed. "What's up with him?" "Teenagers," I said with a shrug, trying to keep my voice light. David chuckled, oblivious as he poured himself a glass of water. "Tell me about it." I stayed in the kitchen long after David had gone upstairs, the tension from the confrontation still buzzing in my chest. Andrew's words echoed in my mind. "Do you feel it, or am I crazy?" I didn't have the courage to answer him then, but I knew the question wasn't going away. It was a week before I could look at Andrew without feeling like my chest was going to cave in. A week of tense silences, stolen glances, and an overwhelming weight pressing down on my every breath. I tried to avoid him, barely speaking, leaving rooms when he entered, finding excuses to stay out longer than usual. But it didn't matter. His presence lingered, even when he wasn't there, like the shadow of a storm cloud that never truly clears. David, ever oblivious, didn't seem to notice the shift. If anything, he was more distracted than ever. Late nights at the office, business trips, casual kisses that felt more like muscle memory than affection. "I thought you might want to talk," he said one evening, surprising me as I sat alone on the couch. I froze, my pulse spiking. "What?" "About us," he said, his voice calm but distant. "I know things haven't been great lately." The words felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Here he was, finally acknowledging the distance between us, but I couldn't bring myself to bridge the gap. Not when the guilt of everything I'd done was suffocating me. "I'm fine," I said, the lie slipping out too easily. "Just tired." David studied me for a moment before nodding. "Let me know if you need anything," he said, and then he was gone again, retreating to his office upstairs. The truth was, I didn't know what I needed. Every time I looked at Andrew, the weight of what had happened between us pressed harder on my chest. It wasn't just guilt. It was shame, regret, and a hollow ache I couldn't shake. I thought distancing myself would help, that putting space between us would make it easier to forget. But the space only made the silence louder. One afternoon, I found myself standing outside Andrew's room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear the faint hum of music coming from inside. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorframe. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words barely audible even to myself. I wasn't sure if I meant it for him or for me. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as David snored softly beside me. The house was silent, but my mind was anything but. I replayed every moment in my head, the kiss in the kitchen, the look in Andrew's eyes when he asked me if it meant anything, the way I'd avoided him since. I hated myself for what I'd done, for the lines I'd crossed, for the damage I'd caused. But I hated something else even more. I hated that part of me didn't want to let it go. The breaking point came the next morning. I was in the kitchen, pouring coffee, when Andrew walked in. He hesitated in the doorway, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in days. "Good morning," I said, forcing a smile that felt painfully fake. "Morning," he replied, his voice quiet. He stepped closer, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something. But instead, he grabbed a glass of water and turned to leave. "Andrew," I said suddenly, the words slipping out before I could stop it. He froze, his hand tightening around the glass. "I think we need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. He turned back to face me, his expression guarded. "About what?" "About everything," I said, the words catching in my throat. I think I've made a terrible mistake." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to walk away. But then he spoke, his voice sharp and laced with frustration. "You think," he said, his words cutting through the air. "You don't think I know that? Do you think I wanted this? Any of it?" I flinched at the anger in his voice, but I didn't stop him. "You're the one who pulled away," he continued, his eyes flashing with hurt. "You're the one who can't even look at me anymore. Like I'm some mistake you can just erase." Tears stung my eyes, and I shook my head. "Andrew, I'm trying to fix this." "Fix it," he said bitterly. "You can't fix this. You can't undo what happened. You can't just pretend it didn't mean anything." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out, because deep down I knew he was right.